Hey everyone, so today we're going to go over the cycles of I. Now in my previous video, we went over complex numbers and we defined that whenever we have a negative, the square root of a -1, it's automatically defined as I. But what happened if we applied an exponent to I, like I to the squared or I to the cube? What would the answer look like then? So let's look at it simply, right? So we know I is the square root of -1 by default. Well, I squared would be square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Now, as a rule, when we multiply two things that are the same, we just end up with what's underneath, right? So let me give a small example here. If we have the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, well, when we combine them, that's the square root of 5 times 5, and that's the square root of 25. But we already know what the square root of 25 is. That's just 5. So instead of dealing with this middle part, we could just skip straight to, oh, well, when we multiply two radicals that have the same inside, then you get rid of the radical and you're left with the inside by itself. So using that logic onto imaginary numbers, we end up with -1. I don't know why I wrote that. We end up with -1. So I squared is -1. So that's another fact. So this is our first fact. This is our second fact. Let's look at I cubed. So I cubed is pretty much this 3 times. Square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Well, we know that the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 is going to give us -1. That's what we got from I squared. So this is pretty much -1. And then we're left with this. But we know the square root of -1 is just I. So we end up with -1 times I. So when we simplify that, I cubed is really just -I. That's another fact. Let's go to I4. I to the fourth is square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. We know this is -1 based on the I squared that we looked at earlier. We also know this is -1. But -1 times -1, well, that's just 1. So I to the fourth is just +1. Now, I titled this cycles of I. So that means that after a certain number of times that we multiply I, numbers repeat. So let's do I to the 5th and see what happens there. So I to the 5th, it's going to be tedious, but I'm going to write everything out. We're going to do square root of -1 5 times. And let's group them. So we know this is -1, we know this is -1, we know this is just I. Well, -1 times -1 times I to the 5th is just I, or I to the 1st. So I to the 5th is the first I. So using that logic, I to the 6th should be the second I, -1. So let's see. I'm going to write this all out. And hopefully by that observation, we should see that pattern. So let's see. Okay, I did 6 of them. Alright, so we know this is -1. We know this is -1. We know this is -1. -1 times -1 is +1, but times another -1 is -1. So I to the 6th is -1, which is the same thing as I squared. So it seems like after the fourth, after four terms of I, we actually repeat the cycle. So our cycles of I are I squared, I cubed, and I4, and then they repeat after. So that means I5, I6, I7, I8 will be the same. Then this is I9, I10, I11, I12, etc. There are actual other patterns to figure out. Like, for example, if you were given I to the 37th, what would that be? We'll cover that in a different video. But this is the basics of what the cycles of I represent. And they'll help you out when you deal with multiplying complex numbers, such as 3i plus 5, and then you have 2i squared minus 11, and then when you distribute, I'm only going to focus on this. 3i times 2i squared, well, that's just 6i cubed, but we know what I cubed is. I cubed is negative I. So when you rewrite this, you're actually rewriting this as 6 times negative I, which is just negative 6i. But like I said, we'll go over that in more detail in another video. What you want to take away is that the first 4 cycles of I are the most important ones to know, because everything else just repeats afterward. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave them in the comment section below, like and subscribe, and I'll make more videos for you guys later. Bye!